Hi there, my name is Austin Carlson. You may know me from the bookmaking class that we share together, and if you're anything like me, you love to read. And one of my favorite things to do when I read is look at the pictures in the books that I read. And when I'm reading these books and reading the pictures in these books, it'll help me to further not only my understanding as it's found within the text, but also further my understanding from these funny pictures, because sometimes words can be a little bit difficult, you know? So to start out, I am going to be doing my presentation here on the article titled The Illustration Revolution by Mr. Michael Twyman. So in order to introduce the topic to you guys, I think it might be a good idea to read the first sentence from this article, in which Mr. Twyman states that the 19th century brought illustrated books and periodicals to large sectors of the British population for the first time. And essentially what this means is that illustrated books, as seen in the previous figures, allowed the British people to read and further their understanding of what they were reading by not only seeing the text and being left with their own imaginations, but also being able to see a really handy little visual aid to guide them on their way. So with that, the primary example of why this was important could be found in a French text titled I don't speak French, and I apologize, Émile's Ode de l'Éducation by Rousseau, which was first published in several European centers outside of France in 1762 and appeared in an English translation in the following year. The influence of such publications on the practice of illustration is hard to pin down, but there is an echo of both the Encyclopedia and Rousseau in the thinking of Charles Knight, one of the pioneering publishers of popular illustration in Britain. He worked for the Penny Magazine, which was a publication, one of the first to include illustrations that could actually be distributed on a mass scale, prospectively for the time, of course, in which he stated that true eye knowledge can sometimes be more instructive than words. Now, I think the meaning of that more effectively than anything else is to say that sometimes when you look and you see something, as opposed to, again, reading it and then drawing your own conclusions from it, when you can look and actually see a picture of it that doesn't require any sort of understanding of language in any major capacity, it's ultimately a lot more beneficial, I think, to someone's overall understanding of the text. I know for me personally, I love picture books. They're real easy to read. So one of the first ways that illustrations were included within text to be printed en masse was through woodcuts. Now, these little woodcuts are real handy. Check it out. Somebody would take a piece of wood and they'd carve into it all funny-like, and they'd take a picture that they were trying to get, and they'd carve it into the wood. And after so many prints, this wood piece would naturally degrade. Now, naturally, through carving it by hand and all, there's really no way to ensure that you could get the exact same thing every time. And through so many prints, it would naturally degrade, which means effectively it was ineffective. And in such, there was a necessity to improve in order to meet the demand for the illustrated literature that many of these Englishmen were looking for. So, with the problems presented from the ineffective portions of the wood engraving, was birthed photomechanical print, produced line and halftone blocks. Such blocks could be integrated with type in much the same way as wood engravings, but they were quicker and cheaper to produce and began to find their way into publications from the 1880s, particularly in periodicals. So essentially, woodcuts just weren't making the cut. And so photomechanical printing, which was cheaper, more effective for the demand, and allowed print houses to produce at the rates necessary to maintain a high profit margin, made their way into the mainstream in the 1880s. So the integration of text and illustration was sporadically achieved in the 19th century by the use of lithography, which was equally suited to the reproduction of handwriting, lettering, and pictures through lithography, which was a cutting-edge printing process by which most printing houses produced their work. The printing houses were able to produce a quality of work that was quick, effective, and cheap, which is really all you ever got to be. And then from there, the response to the wood engravings was to become much more refined in their mark making. Essentially, there was increased competition in wood engraving, and it was considered to be a higher quality product, and so there was some competition within the marketplace therein. So moving on from that, we have a quotation here from page 127 within the article stating that by the middle of the century, photography provided the impetus for most technological developments in printing that related to picture making, but it was not the only route to verisimilitude, which is a word I did not know until today, which for all you people who are like me and do not know what it means the appearance of being true or real. It is pronounced verisimilitude. And if you didn't learn anything else today, you can learn that. Essentially, photography was just unparalleled. You know, there was no way that cuts and lithography could even compare to the real life capturing of an image through photography, which, if you know anything about photography, is just a chemical reaction that occurs within certain metal groups that can be sort of put on paper, which is also similarly very interesting. So, in spite of what was essentially a rapid technological advancement as achieved through the incorporation of photography within printed text, there were still purists who were interested in preserving, I guess, the classical way of producing illustrations within text. So, you know, throughout what is essentially a dynamic and progressing history of technological advancement as incorporated within the literary world, there are always and, you know, continue to be people who are interested in preserving the old way, you know? And so some of the counter arguments made against photography and towards things like woodcuts were mostly made in regards to the quality of woodcuts and the craftsmanship included within such. And as far as lithography, it was generally a price point thing at first. I mean, photographs when they came out initially were very expensive, and on top of that, they weren't really effectively implemented within books just yet. I mean, there are examples included within the text in which the author states that photographs were literally pasted to the pages of books, which, I mean, unless they did like an impeccable job doing that, you could imagine how it might degrade over time or even not come out that good to begin with. And as such, there was probably a tremendous amount of stress placed on having a clean and finished product, especially when you're attempting to sell it. And so, you know, if the photograph that you are including can't be implemented effectively, there probably was a pretty convincing counter argument uh, as to include what would have been outdated technology for the time. But that being said, you know, obviously we're at a point now, as you can see within this wonderful text that I've brought here for you, the history of invention, where photographs are just regularly sort of implemented within a text, and through those photographs, which, you know, again are not woodcuts or lithographic prints, you can see that there's a real clarity of image that otherwise probably couldn't be achieved through simple ink on paper. And that's not to say that there was no practical application for things like lithography, as it was stated again within the essay that specifically for topographical maps and other sort of scientific diagrams, there often was a tremendous amount of necessity for topographical, not what am I saying, for lithographic prints. Because, you know, being able to etch sort of the design of elevation maps and whatnot, and then laying the ink over it and having that little template that you could just do over and over again was a lot more effective than attempting to include a picture, which probably wasn't at a point where it could capture what was attempting to be captured. So these things didn't just fall off the map. It wasn't like through the introduction of photography, all of a sudden, there's no more lithography and there's no more wood cutting. There's just significantly less as the technology continues to develop. Um, so one of the most influential, I guess, for the time, implementations of photography was photozincography, which utilized zinc plates in order to capture a photograph that was then printed on the paper through the zinc, which would have allowed the paper to just sort of really nicely contain the photograph. So, you know, In conclusion, one of the final quotations here from the article, included on page 143 for those of you who are reading along, is that though many books issued between 1830 and 1914 were not illustrated, it can still be argued that the illustrated book was a major factor in defining publishing of the period, and that it changed the concept of the book for good. The following half century was one of consolidation and relative stability technologically, but the innovations of the 19th century can now be seen as preparing for the way for the almost seamless relationship between text and illustration of the second half of the 20th century. So, I mean, it seems obvious to me that illustrations within text stood the test of time. And you can see illustrations within text not only included, as I showed before, within pictures that are drawn here, such as comics. I've got Nice Adventures of Tintin, The Secret of the Unicorn, but you can also see pictures included and illustrations included within maps and topographical sorts of depictors here. As we can see, we've got a really wonderful map of the world, and also in photographs that are included within text to further your understanding of what's being said. And in such, it really is an amazing thing that you could read some words on a page and then see a picture to go along with it to help you grow in your understanding. And that really all these things came about as an effect of technological advancements and the pursuit of higher education. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I really, really hope that you enjoyed it and that I helped you to learn something.